All right, all. Just wanted to kind of show some student work, and talk about kind of the things we're going to learn, just so you have a better idea about what's going to happen. So, all right, we're going to start literally next week learning about HTML or hypertext markup language. We're going to get into, what is a HTML tag, text formatting. We'll talk about image formatting. So taking like a digital image and setting it up for the web. We'll talk about forms. Then we're going to get into cascading style sheets, also known as CSS. We'll talk about using CSS to format text, to set up backgrounds, like background colors and background images. And then using it to do some very basic layouts, which is something called CSS box model, which we'll talk about. We're also going to talk about some design concepts because, this course is a design course. It's part, this course I will admit is kind of like 75% code, 25% design, but there is a design element. That's what makes this a design class and not this is why it's here, not in the computer science department, because design is part of this. Okay. You guys are your first major project kind of puts all this together. It puts together understanding of HTML, CSS, and then kind of planning out a multi-page interactive project. Okay, it's called Choose Your Own Adventure. So you're going to make kind of a very simple choose your own adventure interactive story experience, whatever you want to call it. These are some examples from last semester. So this is a project. So, this particular student used CSS to format the text, format the colors, this dark navy blue with the sort of lighter blue on top. She used ChatGPT to generate the images, which I do allow. I use it as long as it's for images and not for code. So it's like, okay, there's like questions here, or you can go between, there's like choices. These are hyperlinks that connect pages. And we'll talk all about this. I thought it was so, it's part code. There's actual code. Like, here's the code. Oops, actually, I lied. There's the code. All right, this is HTML. Eventually, there is CSS, which is this aspect of it. But, there's the visual part too. That's what makes it interesting. This person kind of made a I think they kind of combined like real photos they took. So this is like kind of like a little, it's kind of like a horror game where you kind of choose. So it's like you're in the dorm and you can like, I don't know if this is their actual dorm or they just found photos or used AI, but I like the idea of it. I like the fact that it looked like he kind of used real photos of his own to kind of make it more interesting. Same kind of idea, it's like structured. There's some text, interaction. Here's another one. Once again, it's like, there's text, it's formatted, there's hyperlinks, there's some interesting photos. I don't know if this person used AI or drew them or, found them. I'm okay with, finding image. It's not an illustration course or, photo editing course. I'm not as like, strictly about that. Notice how there's like different choices. I thought the visual style was very interesting and it was a cute story, At the end of the day, code is code and that's great and everything, but you need something that interacts with humans, something that gets the human in all of us to want to interact, right? That's what separates like, AI can do things, don't get me wrong, but it's not necessarily great at like making something that appeals to humans. You know what I mean? Like you can build a website, but is it content that actually engages people? You know what I mean? This is another one. This person did a kind of sci-fi. So you can see the kind of different visual styles and how imagery can definitely play into this and fun stories and, kind of ease us into the idea of coding and making something interesting that's appealing to people. Then we're going to get in, really talk a lot about layout. Um, Layout is when you have like, okay, where does content go? So if I were to go to say SF State's website, it's like, okay, this is, there's a layout of like, okay, here's this navigation area with like the name of the university and then this and the navigation bar. There's like columns here, right? One, two, three, four. It's all could be like one big page, kind of like the way a Microsoft Word page would be, but A, that would be kind of inefficient, and B, it would be not as visually interesting. So the point of this is to, um, to have layout. And that's kind of what we learn. We learn something called CSS grids, which allows us to set up grids, something called flexible box or flexbox. We'll talk about something called positioning and something called floating, which is an old school way of doing some layout elements. And then the idea is that you're going to build a two-page website. So this person built a kind of a store for like a, you know, kind of knick-knacky kind of thing. So it's like, notice how there's like columns here. One, two, three, one, two. So you're going to build a very simple two-page website, so this is kind of like their Etsy kind of account of cute little things, right? And so it's about layout. Notice how the layout was different than those in the first one, first project. So I just thought this person's visual style was really interesting. They used a lot of neutral colors here, like home interior. So like see how they're using kind of layout here to create a kind of a visual mood. This is another one where it's like, you can see the use of columns here. This one even has kind of flexible design. It's probably Flexbox here if I had to guess. Okay. And then we talk about some other stuff. When we get to this part, it's kind of like this is interesting stuff to know, but isn't necessary for a formal website, but like things like CSS animation. So you can actually do some very simple animations with CSS, something called transitions. We'll talk about something called CSS functions and CSS variables. The CSS variables is definitely kind of the new thing in town that a lot of developers are using. Basically, it's a way to sort of simplify applying certain values again and again within a project easily. Um, but we're really going to get into this concept called responsive design. What is responsive design? Glad you asked. Well, we live in a world where we have a lot of devices, right? I'm looking at SF State's website on my laptop, but you could also use that same thing. I could view that same website on my phone, and you could view it on your smart TV and your tablet and whatever else Apple invents, right? And the thing is, like, what differs a web page from, say, print design is when you print a poster for someone's wall or whatever. It's like if you set up your project to be 8.5 by 11, it's always 8.5 by 11. It's never not 8.5 by 11. But technically, there is no one size for a web page because at any point your user can do this and make the page wider or thinner, right? And so as designers, we have to think about, okay, well, if you have a wide layout, or wide page, what would the layout look like that's easy for people to interact with? And the same is like, well, what if it's like this, right? This is kind of what you would see on like a smartphone. And it's like, notice how the layout's different. We had like multiple columns and now it's like one column, right? And like you might notice that it's like, okay, normally there's this navigation bar here, but on smaller devices where maybe there's more limited real estate, as we would say, it's like now there's this button. And if you click on it, the navigation bar basically only appears if you hit a little drop down and it's vertical as opposed to horizontal and blah, blah, blah. And so this is stuff that we can do. We can plan something. And this as a general concept within web development is called responsive design, which is making a web page that can work at different sizes. Okay. We'll get into how we can do that. And it sounds complicated, but it's actually really not. Once you really understand the basics of how web pages work, which by this point you will within the course, learning how to make it responsive is not that much more difficult, at least in my humble opinion. So I'm just going to show some examples of ones students did last semester so you get an idea. So in the final project, students make a web page that is responsive, meaning it works at different web sizes. So here, this particular student has a 3-column layout. They built like a little bookstore web page. And what I'm going to do is I'm using this built-in thing within my browser in Chrome that lets me look at the web pages at different dimensions easily. So this is what it would look like at wide, but then when I make this smaller, this is the width of the page. So when it goes to below 800, notice how it's like, okay, it went from like you notice how it's like 2 columns now, right? And now it like went from 5 to 2, to 3. Um, Notice how like the navigation bar disappeared, and then like now this goes underneath, and now it's 1 column. So this is about thinking about, okay, how do we make a product, in this case, the product is the web page, work for the users at different sizes. You know what I mean? Because that's something that's going to happen in real life. People might view your website on their phone while they're out on the go, or they might be at home on their desktop, their laptop, like I am currently, and everything in between. Here's another one where it's like a coffee shop, kind of hip, cool looking coffee shop website. And so, you can see when it gets down to like the drinks and everything, there's like a kind of a 4-column layout here. And for this, it would be kind of like maybe the size of a tablet. Becomes a 2-column layout. And then, oops, looks like they need to work on that. But it would become like a 1-column layout. Here's another one. This is for people. This guy built like a game website for different sizes. And so it's like, once again, you can see it's like it turns into kind of a more 2-column layout and then eventually like a 1-column layout. And we'll talk about this. I know it seems complicated, but it's really not once you sort of understand the basics of how responsive web design works. Same thing, this person did a website for a playhouse. So, this is like this particular size is meant for desktops where it's like, I got all this space. We have multiple columns for different actors and whatnot. And then I'm just going to make this smaller. So when it gets to like here, we call this a breakpoint. Now it's a 2-column layout. I'm not going to lie, they could work on their positioning a little bit here, but hey, say la vie. Also, notice how this has become static. We'll also talk about how you can do that in layout, making something called a sticky, so it always remains on screen regardless of how the page gets up and down. All right, so that is what we're going to be doing through the semester. Hopefully that gives you a good idea of like the topics we're going to cover and also like how you're going to apply this towards the projects that we're doing. Okay.